You've heard of saints who seem like they walked straight out of a horror story, haven't you? Stories so mysterious that even the most faithful can't explain them. Today we're diving into the shadows of sainthood, where divine miracles meet spine-chilling terror, and where the line between heaven and nightmare becomes terrifyingly thin. When we think of saints, we picture gentle souls bathed in golden light, offering comfort and peace. But what if I told you that some of Christianity's most revered figures carry with them tales that would make Stephen King jealous? These aren't your Sunday school saints. These are holy men and women whose lives were marked by visions so disturbing, experiences so bizarre, and miracles so unsettling that they challenge everything we think we know about divine intervention. We're talking about saints who returned from the dead, who witnessed hellish torments, who endured suffering so extreme it defied human understanding, and who performed acts that blur the line between divine justice and terrifying vengeance. But here's the thing. These aren't modern urban legends or Hollywood fabrications. These are documented accounts, recorded by monks, chronicled by medieval historians, and preserved in the official records of the Catholic Church itself. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, do you believe these chilling stories are divine revelation, or just medieval imagination gone wild? I'd love to hear your thoughts. But are these accounts merely the product of superstition, or genuine spiritual revelations that our modern world would rather forget? What you're about to hear might challenge your understanding of what it truly means to be touched by the divine. Because sometimes God's light casts the darkest shadows. Stay with me as we explore 4 saints whose stories will haunt you long after this video ends. Our first saint died at the age of 21 in the year 1224. But Christina the Astonishing's story doesn't end with death. It begins with it. Picture this. Christina lies in her coffin during her own funeral mass. The priest is delivering the eulogy when suddenly, impossibly, she sits up. The entire congregation flees in terror, leaving only her sister and the priest frozen in shock. But Christina doesn't just return to life, she levitates. She floats to the church rafters, perching there like some otherworldly creature, claiming she couldn't bear the stench of human sin rising from the people below. What Christina described next was perhaps even more disturbing. She claimed she had been to hell, purgatory, and heaven. She described souls writhing in unimaginable torment, their screams echoing through dimensions we can't comprehend. She spoke of punishments so specific, so horrific, that medieval chroniclers hesitated to record them in full detail. For the next 42 years of her miraculous second life, Christina would perform increasingly bizarre acts. She would throw herself into furnaces and emerge unburned. She would freeze herself in winter rivers for days. She would curl into impossibly small spaces, her body contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. The church documented her case extensively, with multiple witnesses testifying to these impossible feats. But here's what makes it truly chilling. Christina claimed all of this suffering was voluntary, that she was taking on the punishments meant for souls in purgatory, physically experiencing their torment to speed their journey to heaven. Imagine living next to someone who regularly threw herself into fires, claiming they were saving souls you couldn't see from torments you couldn't imagine. If Christina's story shocked you, wait until you hear about our next saint, a woman who turned vengeance into a weapon so brutal yet was later crowned with sainthood. Make sure you're subscribed because the next legend is darker still. Now let's travel to 10th century Kiev, where we meet Saint Olga, a woman whose path to sainthood was paved with calculated, horrific revenge. When Olga's husband, Prince Igor, was brutally murdered by a neighboring tribe called the Drevlians, they made a fatal mistake. They sent matchmakers to convince Olga to marry their prince, thinking they could claim Kiev through marriage. What happened next reads like something from the darkest corners of medieval literature, yet it's recorded as historical fact. Olga invited the Drevlian matchmakers to Kiev, honoring them with a feast. But instead of escorting them to the palace, she had them carried in their boats and buried alive, boats and all. As they suffocated beneath the earth, she reportedly stood above, asking if the honor pleased them. But she wasn't finished. Olga invited more Drevlians to Kiev, this time requesting their most distinguished citizens. When they arrived and went to bathe, a customary ritual, she locked them in the bathhouse and set it ablaze. Every single one burned alive. Her final act of vengeance was perhaps the most chilling. She pretended to make peace with the Drevlians and requested a simple tribute, 3 sparrows and 3 pigeons from each household. When the birds were delivered, she tied incendiary devices to their feet and released them. The birds flew home, setting the entire Drevlian city ablaze. Thousands died in those flames. Yet decades later, after converting to Christianity and dedicating her life to spreading the faith, Olga was canonized as a saint. The Church declared her equal to the apostles, one of the highest honors possible. How do we reconcile this? How does someone who orchestrated mass murder through burning birds become a saint? Was her transformation genuine repentance? Or does it reveal that God's grace can redeem even the darkest human actions? Think about it. Olga's story forces us to face an uncomfortable question. Can a person's sins, no matter how horrifying, be washed clean by faith and conversion? And if so, what does that say about the depths of divine mercy? Tell me what you think in the comments. Was Olga's canonization a triumph of grace over vengeance, or a disturbing reminder that sainthood sometimes carries shadows we'd rather ignore? Next, we'll move to Italy, where a gentle friar's gift of prayer brought him into terrifying contact with souls trapped in purgatory. In 14th century Italy, Saint Nicholas of Tolentine was known for his gentle nature and tireless devotion to prayer. But his spiritual gift came with a terrifying price. He could see and communicate with souls trapped in purgatory. Night after night, Nicholas was visited by apparitions of the dead. These were not peaceful spirits seeking comfort. They were souls in agony, bearing the marks of their purification. They appeared to him burned, twisted, crying out in torment, pleading desperately for his prayers. Witnesses reported that Nicholas would sometimes wake his fellow monks with his own screams, having just endured visions so horrifying that his physical body reacted as if he were experiencing them himself. He would emerge from these episodes with burn marks, scratches, and wounds that matched the suffering he claimed to have seen. But what made these encounters even more disturbing was the presence of people Nicholas had known in life. Parishioners, fellow clergy, even family members, appearing before him in unbearable anguish, begging him to offer masses and prayers for their relief. Nicholas became consumed by these visions. He would spend entire nights in prayer, refusing food or sleep, exhausting his body in an effort to ease the torment of souls he could not ignore. Some monks reported hearing multiple voices coming from his cell, Nicholas praying aloud, and other unfamiliar voices responding with cries of desperation. The Church investigated these events carefully. Testimonies were gathered, physical evidence documented, and witnesses questioned. The conclusion was undeniable. Nicholas was somehow bridging the gap between the living and the dead, experiencing purgatory not as an idea, but as a reality that left physical traces on his body. Think about the weight of such a gift. To dedicate your life to prayer is one thing, but to carry the cries of countless souls in your ears, to see their suffering etched onto your very flesh, that is a burden almost too great for one man to bear. So we must ask, was this a blessing or a curse? Was Nicholas chosen by God to comfort the suffering dead, or was he himself being tested by visions meant to shatter his peace? What do you think? Could you bear such a mission, knowing every night might bring the screams of souls you once loved? Share your thoughts below, because Nicholas's story forces us to confront a haunting truth. Sanctity is not always peaceful. Sometimes it's marked by horror that never lets you rest. Next, we'll meet a young girl whose broken rib became the doorway to nearly 4 decades of unexplainable suffering. Suffering so extreme it blurred the line between miracle and nightmare. Our final saint story begins with what seemed like a simple accident. In 1395, 15-year-old Lidwina of Schiedam went ice skating with friends. She fell and broke a rib, an injury that should have healed within weeks. Instead, it became the doorway to nearly 4 decades of unexplainable suffering that defied all human understanding. Lidwina's condition worsened rapidly. Her body began to decay while she remained alive. Witnesses reported that pieces of her flesh would fall away, yet she continued to breathe. At times she would vomit what seemed to be her internal organs, only to function normally afterward. Her limbs twisted into unnatural positions, bones broke spontaneously, and wounds appeared without cause. But what makes her case both mystical and disturbing is that Lidwina claimed her suffering was not meaningless. She said she had been chosen to share in Christ's passion, stretching the agony of his crucifixion across decades of her own life. Doctors and clergy examined her repeatedly, unable to explain what they witnessed. She lived for years without eating solid food, sustained only by the Eucharist. Visitors described her room filling with unearthly light. Others claimed that roses would bloom from her wounds. For 38 years, Lidwina endured what no human body should have been able to survive. She spoke of visions of heaven and hell, describing realities beyond comprehension, while her body remained a battlefield of torment and miracle. And then, in 1433, when death finally came, something astonishing happened. The body that had decayed for decades was found to be perfectly preserved, radiating a fragrance of sweetness that lingered for days. What do we make of this? Was Lidwina's life a prolonged miracle of redemptive suffering, or a nightmare misunderstood by her contemporaries? Was her agony a punishment, or a divine mission to reveal how suffering itself can become a prayer? The Church saw in her not madness, but sanctity. She was canonized, remembered as a mystic who bore the cross of Christ's passion in her very flesh. But her story leaves us uneasy, forcing us to wonder, what if true holiness sometimes looks like horror to human eyes? And that brings us to the end of this journey through 4 chilling Catholic legends. Christina the Astonishing, who returned from the grave with visions of torment. Olga of Kiev, who transformed vengeance into sainthood. Nicholas of Tolentine, who bridged the world of the living and the suffering dead. And Lidwina of Schiedam, whose body became a living crucifixion. These are the saints with dark sides, not because they were evil, but because their encounters with the divine drew them into realms of suffering and mystery that most of us would never dare to face. So I leave you with this question. Which of these stories unsettled you the most? Christina's resurrection into torment, Olga's brutal vengeance, Nicholas's nights haunted by purgatory, or Lidwina's decades of unimaginable suffering? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep uncovering the mysteries of faith and history, stories too strange, too powerful, and too unsettling to ignore, make sure you subscribe and join me on this journey, because sometimes the truth of sainthood is not bathed in golden light. Sometimes God's light casts the darkest shadows.